A storm led her into a church. A pastor led her into a new life. Emma had died 3 times in her life. The first time was when her mother collapsed at the hospital. The second time was when her stepfather threw her out of the house. And tonight, as she stood shivering outside the church doors, would be the 3rd time. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the pale face of the 22-year-old girl. 8 months of wandering had left her looking like a ghost, with sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, and an old hoodie covered in mud stains. Her trembling hand knocked on the door. Once, twice, 3 times. The door opened. Golden light spilled out. A gray-haired man stood there, showing no surprise despite it being 2 in the morning. "Are you hungry, child?" Those 5 simple words had just saved Emma from her 3rd death. She didn't know it yet. The November storm raged through the small streets of Pine Valley, with thunder rolling across the sky and rain pounding the pavement like bullets. Emma stumbled through the darkness, soaked to the bone and exhausted both physically and mentally. She clutched her old backpack tightly, memories flashing through her mind of the past few days sleeping at train stations, in parks, and cheap motels where the walls were paper-thin and safety was just an illusion. The church appeared like a lighthouse in the storm, its warm yellow light glowing through stained glass windows. Emma had been walking aimlessly for hours, not really looking for shelter, just moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. But something about this place made her pause. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the way the light seemed to reach out to her through the rain. She hesitated at the wooden doors, knowing that once she knocked, there would be no taking it back. Churches meant questions, and questions meant lies or truths she wasn't ready to share. But the cold had seeped through her clothes and into her bones, and her stomach had been empty for 2 days straight. Pastor William Johnson opened the door with the calm expression of a man who had seen broken souls arrive at all hours. At 52, he had learned that desperate people didn't keep regular schedules. His kind eyes took in the shivering girl without judgment, noting the way she held herself ready to run, the careful distance she maintained even while asking for help. "Come in," he said simply, stepping aside. "There's a warm room in the back and soup on the stove." He didn't ask her name or where she'd come from. In his 15 years as pastor of this small community church, he'd learned that trust was built with actions, not questions. Emma followed him through the sanctuary, her wet shoes squeaking against the wooden floors. The space was simple but beautiful, with rows of worn pews and candles flickering near the altar. Everything smelled of old wood, and something she couldn't identify until she realized it was peace. She hadn't felt peace in so long that she'd forgotten what it smelled like. The room Pastor William led her to was small but cozy, with a single bed, a reading chair, and a space heater that hummed quietly in the corner. Clean towels sat folded on the dresser, and Emma wondered how many other lost souls had found refuge in this same space. "The bathroom's through that door," William said, pointing to a corner of the room. "Take your time getting cleaned up. I'll bring you something to eat." He paused at the doorway, his hand on the frame. "You're safe here. Whatever brought you to my door tonight, you're safe now." Emma stood alone in the room, dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor. Safe. The word felt foreign in her mouth, like a language she'd once known but had forgotten how to speak. She touched the towels, half expecting them to disappear, then looked toward the bed with its clean white sheets, and wondered when she'd last slept somewhere that someone else hadn't slept first. The hot shower felt like a luxury she didn't deserve. The water washed away 8 months of fear and dirt and the smell of places where desperate people gathered. She stood under the spray until the water ran cold, watching mud and grime swirl down the drain, wishing her memories could be washed away as easily. When she emerged, Pastor William had left a tray outside her door. Chicken soup that actually had chunks of chicken in it, fresh bread that was still warm, and coffee that didn't taste like it had been made yesterday. There was also a note written in careful handwriting that said, "Tomorrow is Sunday. You're welcome to join us for service, but sleeping in is also a form of worship. Rest well, Emma." She stared at the note, wondering how he knew her name, then realized she must have told him at some point during their brief conversation. The fact that she couldn't remember made her realize just how exhausted she really was. For the first time in months, Emma ate until she was full, then lay down on the bed without checking the locks on the doors or planning her escape route. The next morning, Emma woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the distant sound of church bells. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, and panic fluttered in her chest until she saw the tray from the night before and remembered the kind pastor who had asked for nothing in return for his kindness. She'd expected to wake up feeling guilty about accepting help from a stranger, but instead she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: rested. Her body wasn't tense with the constant vigilance required to survive on the streets. Her stomach wasn't gnawing with hunger. For once, she could think about something other than where her next meal would come from, or where she'd sleep that night. Through her window, she could see families walking toward the church in their Sunday best, children skipping ahead of their parents, elderly couples moving slowly but steadily toward the doors. It was a picture of normalcy that seemed as foreign to Emma as life on another planet. She'd once been part of that world when she lived with her mother and attended Sunday service at St. Paul's Methodist Church downtown. Before everything fell apart, before her mother Linda died suddenly of a heart attack during Emma's final semester of nursing school, before her stepfather Jake, overwhelmed by grief and debt, sold the house and told Emma she was old enough to take care of herself. Before 8 months of wandering from city to city, taking temporary jobs and sleeping wherever she could find shelter, Emma had been a good student once. She'd had plans and dreams and a future that stretched out before her like a bright highway. She was going to be a nurse like her mother, helping people heal, making a difference in the world. Now she couldn't even take care of herself. A gentle knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Emma?" Pastor William's voice was soft, respectful. "I'm making breakfast if you'd like to join me. No pressure if you'd prefer to rest." She found him in the small kitchen that adjoined his office, scrambling eggs and buttering toast, with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been cooking for himself for a long time. He looked different in the morning light, younger somehow, wearing jeans and a simple gray sweater instead of the dress clothes she'd expected. "I hope you slept well," he said, not looking up from the stove. "The weather's cleared up nicely. Storms have a way of washing everything clean, don't they?" Emma accepted the plate he offered her, noting how he filled it generously without making a show of his kindness. The eggs were perfectly cooked, and the toast was the kind of golden brown that required attention and care. These were the details that mattered when you'd been hungry, she realized. The difference between food that was thrown together and food that was prepared with love. "I should probably be going," Emma said, though she made no move to leave the table. "I don't want to impose on your Sunday." "Where are you headed?" William asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. The question hung in the air between them. Emma realized she had no answer. She'd been moving for so long without a destination that she'd forgotten how to imagine a future beyond the next day or week. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "West, maybe. I hear there are jobs in California." "There are jobs here too," William said mildly. "Not glamorous ones, but honest work. Mrs. Thompson needs help at the diner, and the library could use someone to reorganize their back files." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Of course, that's only if you were thinking about staying somewhere for a while. Sometimes it's good to stop moving long enough to figure out where you actually want to go." Emma studied his face, looking for the hidden agenda she'd learned to expect from adults who offered help. But Pastor William's expression remained open and patient, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for her answer. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked finally. "You don't know anything about me. I could be anyone." "You're someone who needed shelter from a storm," he replied simply. "That's all I need to know." He paused, considering his words carefully. "I found that people usually show up when they're supposed to. You showed up last night. Maybe there's a reason for that." The service was beautiful in its simplicity. Emma watched from the back pew as Pastor William spoke about finding hope in unexpected places and how sometimes the things that seem like endings are actually beginnings. His voice was gentle but strong, and he spoke directly to his congregation as if he were having a personal conversation with each person rather than delivering a sermon. The people in the pews looked like regular folks, not the judgmental religious types Emma had been expecting. There were families with squirming children, elderly people who sang hymns with voices cracked by age, teenagers who listened with varying degrees of attention. When they stood to sing, Emma found herself humming along to songs she remembered from her childhood. During the offering, she noticed that people gave what they could without fanfare. Some dropped in bills, others coins, and a few put in envelopes that might have contained nothing at all. No one looked around to see what others were contributing. It was the most honest display of community Emma had witnessed in months. After the service, Several people approached her with warm smiles and gentle introductions. Mrs. Betty Anderson, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes, pressed a container of homemade cookies into Emma's hands. "Welcome, dear," she said with a slight southern accent that reminded Emma of her own grandmother. "I hope you'll come back next week." David Miller, a man about Emma's age who walked with a slight limp, shook her hand and said, "First time at Pastor Williams' church? He's good people. This whole place is." His smile was genuine, and Emma noticed that his clothes, while clean, had been mended several times. Here was someone who understood what it meant to make do with less. Emma spent the afternoon helping Pastor William with small tasks around the church, straightening hymnals, watering the plants in the sanctuary, dusting the wooden cross that hung behind the altar. The work was simple and soothing, requiring no complicated decisions or explanations. For the first time in months, Emma felt useful rather than just grateful. "You have good hands for this kind of work," William observed, as Emma carefully cleaned the stained glass windows, making the colored light dance more brightly across the floor. "Patient hands. That's a gift not everyone has. My mother always said I was good at taking care of things," Emma replied, then caught herself mentioning her past. She'd been trying not to think about her mother, about the dreams they'd shared and the future they'd planned together. "Tell me about her," William said gently, settling into one of the front pews to watch Emma work. For a moment, Grace considered deflecting the question as she'd learned to do when strangers got too curious. But something about the peaceful atmosphere of the church and Pastor Daniel's patient presence made her want to talk about her mother for the first time since the funeral. "She was a nurse at Metro General," Grace began, her voice soft with memory. "Night shift in the ER. She said that's where you could really help people, when they were scared and hurting and needed someone to care." Grace paused in her cleaning, lost in thought. "She worked so hard to pay for my nursing school, always said education was the one thing nobody could take away from you." "Sounds like she was proud of you," Daniel said. "She was." Grace's voice grew thick with emotion. "I was supposed to graduate last spring, top of my class. I was going to surprise her at graduation, but then she had the heart attack and I never got the chance to make her proud." The words hung in the air between them, carrying 8 months of grief and regret. Grace set down her cleaning supplies and wrapped her arms around herself, finally giving voice to the guilt that had been eating at her from the inside. "I was a nursing student and I couldn't save my own mother," she whispered. "I knew CPR, I knew the signs, but when I found her collapsed in the kitchen, I just froze. By the time the paramedics came, it was too late. Some nurse I would have made." Pastor Daniel was quiet for a long moment, allowing Grace's pain to fill the space between them without trying to immediately fix it or explain it away. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of his own experience with loss. "I was a soldier once," he said, surprising Grace with this unexpected revelation. "Afghanistan, 2 tours. I lost my best friend David in an IED explosion on a road I was supposed to be patrolling that day. Switched shifts at the last minute because I had a headache." He stared at the cross behind the altar, his eyes distant with memory. "I spent 3 years after I came home drinking myself to sleep every night, convinced that David died because I wasn't there to save him. Took me a long time to understand that surviving doesn't make you guilty of anything except being human." Grace looked at this man who had shown her such kindness, trying to reconcile his gentle demeanor with the image of a combat soldier. "How did you get past it?" "I found something bigger than my guilt," Daniel replied. "I found a way to honor David's memory by helping other people who were lost and hurting. Turned out that's what I was supposed to be doing all along. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find out who you really are." The conversation marked a turning point in Grace's stay at the church. Over the following weeks, she found herself settling into routines that felt almost normal. She helped Mrs. Peterson at the diner during breakfast and lunch rushes, earning enough money to contribute to her room and board, despite Pastor Daniel's protests that it wasn't necessary. In the evenings, she assisted with the church's community meal program, serving dinner to anyone who needed it on Wednesdays and Sundays. The people who came were a mix of homeless individuals, elderly folks living on fixed incomes, and working families who sometimes struggled to make ends meet. Grace was surprised to find herself feeling at home among these people who understood what it meant to need help. Marcus became a regular presence in her days. She learned that he'd been living in his car for 6 months after losing his job at the factory, and that the limp came from an accident that had cost him both his employment and his health insurance. Despite his circumstances, he maintained an optimism that Grace found both inspiring and puzzling. "You've got to look for the good stuff," he told her one evening as they cleaned up after the community meal. "If you only focus on what's wrong, you'll miss the things that are going right. Like this place, like Pastor Dan, like the fact that we're both here talking instead of somewhere else feeling sorry for ourselves." Mrs. Elena took Grace under her wing in the way that surrogate mothers do, teaching her to make the kind of comfort food that fed both body and soul. In Elena's kitchen, Grace learned that cooking could be a form of prayer, a way of showing love through the careful preparation of simple ingredients. "Food made with love tastes different," Elena explained, as she showed Grace how to make her famous chicken and rice. "The ingredients are the same, but when you cook for people you care about, they can taste the difference. That's why the community meals here always fill people up better than the food at the shelter downtown." As winter deepened, Grace found herself thinking less about moving on and more about staying. The church had become a sanctuary in the truest sense, a place where she could exist without pretending to be someone she wasn't. Pastor Daniel never pressured her to make any commitments or decisions about her future, but he did encourage her to think about what she wanted her life to look like. "What did you love about nursing?" he asked one evening as they sat in his office, going over the budget for the community meal program. Grace considered the question carefully. "I loved the idea of helping people heal," she said finally. "Not just fixing their bodies, but making them feel cared for when they were vulnerable. My mom always said that healing happens when people feel safe enough to get better." "And do you still want that?" Daniel pressed gently. "To help people heal?" "I think so," Grace admitted. "But I can't go back to school. I don't have the money, and after dropping out so close to graduation, I doubt any program would accept me." "There are other ways to help people heal," Daniel pointed out. "Look at what you're doing here. Mrs. Elena says the community meal program has grown every week since you started helping. People trust you. They feel safe around you. That's not a small thing." Grace hadn't noticed the changes in herself until Pastor Daniel pointed them out. She was sleeping through the night now, without the hypervigilance that had characterized her months on the road. She laughed more easily, especially when Marcus told his elaborate stories about the people he encountered during his job search adventures. She'd gained weight and color in her cheeks, and her eyes had lost the hollow, hunted look that had defined her features when she first arrived. More importantly, she'd begun to think about the future again. Not the grand plans she'd once had, but smaller, more immediate goals. She wanted to get her GED if she didn't already qualify for it. She wanted to learn more about nutrition and food service so she could expand the community meal program. She wanted to save enough money to rent a small apartment, something modest but entirely her own. The turning point came on a cold February evening when a new face appeared at the community meal. A young woman about Grace's age, clearly pregnant, and trying to hide the fact that she'd been crying. She sat alone at a corner table, barely touching her food, jumping every time someone approached. Grace recognized the look immediately, the careful positioning near the exit, the way the girl's eyes tracked every movement in the room, the protective curve of her arms around her belly. This was someone who had been hurt and was expecting more hurt to follow. Instead of letting Pastor Daniel or Mrs. Elena handle the situation, Grace found herself approaching the girl's table with a cup of hot chocolate and a plate of Mrs. Elena's cookies. "Mind if I sit?" Grace asked, keeping her voice low and non-threatening. "These tables are too big for one person anyway." The girl looked up with startled eyes, nodding hesitantly. Grace settled into the chair across from her, noting the way the girl's hands shook as she lifted her cup. "I'm Grace," she said simply. "I help out here sometimes." "This your first time?" "Sarah," the girl whispered. "Yes. I wasn't sure I should come, but I heard the food was free and I haven't eaten much today." "Well, you came to the right place. Mrs. Elena makes the best comfort food in 3 counties, and Pastor Dan never asks questions unless you want to answer them." Grace pushed the cookies closer to Sarah. "You should eat something. The baby needs the nutrition." Sarah's hands moved protectively to her stomach. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess," Grace said with a gentle smile. "Plus, I was in nursing school for a while, learned to notice things like that." She paused, studying Sarah's pale complexion and the way she winced when she shifted in her chair. "When's the last time you saw a doctor?" "I can't afford a doctor," Sarah admitted. I was saving money for the baby, but then my boyfriend took it all and left, said he wasn't ready to be a father." Her voice broke on the last words, and Grace felt a familiar surge of protective anger on behalf of someone else's pain. "There's a free clinic downtown," Grace said. "Dr. Martinez sees pregnant women on sliding scale fees. I could go with you if you want, help you navigate the paperwork." Sarah looked up with surprise. "You'd do that? But you don't even know me." "Someone helped me when I needed it," Grace replied, thinking of Pastor Daniel opening his door on that stormy night. "Seems like the right thing to pass it along." That night, Grace lay in her small room thinking about the conversation with Sarah and the way it had felt natural to offer help instead of just accepting it. For months, she'd been the one in need, the one seeking assistance and shelter and kindness from others. But tonight, for the first time since her mother's death, she'd felt like she had something valuable to offer someone else. The next morning, she found Pastor Daniel in his office, working on his sermon for the upcoming Sunday. "I want to do more," she told him without preamble. "With the community meal program, I mean. I met a girl last night who needs help, and I realized there are probably lots of people like her who don't know where to find resources." Daniel looked up from his notes with interest. "What did you have in mind?" "What if we started offering more than just meals?" Grace began, her words coming faster as the ideas formed. "What if we had information about health services, job placement, housing assistance? What if we connected people with resources instead of just feeding them once or twice a week?" "That's a big undertaking," Daniel said thoughtfully. "It would require coordination with other organizations, volunteers with specific skills, maybe even some funding for supplies and space." "I know," Grace said, undaunted by the challenges. "But I think it could work. I think people want to help. They just don't know how. And there are people who need help but don't know where to find it. Maybe we could be the bridge between them." Pastor Daniel set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying Grace with the expression of someone seeing a familiar person in a new light. "You know what you're describing, don't you? You're talking about social work, community outreach, the kind of work that requires training and certification." Grace felt her enthusiasm deflate slightly. "I know I don't have the credentials for that kind of work." "Not yet," Daniel agreed, "but credentials can be earned. There are community college programs, online courses, volunteer training opportunities. If this is what you feel called to do, there are ways to make it happen." The word called resonated with Grace in a way she hadn't expected. She'd never thought of herself as having a calling, but sitting in Pastor Daniel's office, imagining ways to help people like Sarah find the support they needed, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before her mother's death: purpose. "I'd need to save money for school," Grace said, her mind already working through the practical details, "and I'd have to figure out how to study while working. It wouldn't be easy." "The best things usually aren't," Daniel replied. "But you wouldn't be doing it alone. This church has supported people through education before. Mrs. Elena put 3 grandchildren through college by organizing fundraisers and scholarship applications. Marcus has been talking about starting a carpentry apprenticeship program. There's precedent for the community investing in people who want to better themselves and give back." That Sunday, Pastor Daniel announced the expansion of the community meal program during his sermon, explaining the vision Grace had shared with him and inviting congregation members to volunteer their time and expertise. The response was overwhelming. Dr. Martinez offered to hold monthly free health clinics. A retired social worker volunteered to help navigate the bureaucracy of government assistance programs. The owner of a local printing shop donated materials for resource guides and informational flyers. Within a month, what had started as simple meal service had evolved into a comprehensive support network. Grace found herself at the center of it all, coordinating volunteers, maintaining resource lists, and serving as a bridge between people in need and the services available to help them. Sarah became a regular fixture at the church, not just as someone receiving assistance, but as someone offering it as well. Her experience with the welfare system made her uniquely qualified to help other young mothers navigate the complicated process of applying for benefits and services. Watching Sarah transform from someone seeking help to someone providing it, Grace began to understand what Pastor Daniel had meant about finding purpose in helping others heal. The spring brought both opportunities and challenges. Grace had enrolled in evening classes at the community college, working toward her certification in social work, while continuing to coordinate the church's outreach programs during the day. The schedule was demanding, but she found energy in having goals that extended beyond simple survival. Marcus had started his carpentry apprenticeship and was talking about eventually opening a workshop where he could teach job skills to other people transitioning out of homelessness. Mrs. Elena had taken over the food service coordination, freeing Grace to focus on connecting people with resources and following up on their progress. The challenge came in the form of Grace's stepfather, Rick, who appeared at the church on a Tuesday evening in late April, looking older and more worn than Grace remembered. She was in the community room, helping a client fill out job applications, when Pastor Daniel appeared in the doorway with an expression that immediately put her on alert. "Grace," he said quietly, "there's someone here to see you." She found Rick sitting in the front pew of the sanctuary, his hands clasped between his knees and his head bowed. He looked up when she entered, and Grace was shocked by the change in his appearance. The man who had once seemed so intimidating now looked frail and defeated, his clothes hanging loose on his diminished frame. "Hello, Grace," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You look good, healthy." "What do you want, Rick?" Grace asked, keeping her distance and her voice carefully neutral. She was acutely aware of Pastor Daniel's presence in the back of the sanctuary, close enough to intervene if necessary but far enough away to give them privacy. "I wanted to see you," Rick said, "to apologize. I know I handled everything wrong after your mother died. I was grief-stricken and overwhelmed, and I took it out on you when you needed support most." "I'm sorry." Grace studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation she'd learned to expect from him, but what she saw instead was genuine remorse and a weariness that spoke of months or years of regret. "You threw me out of the house 3 days after Mom's funeral," Grace said, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "You told me I was an adult, and it was time I learned to take care of myself. You sold everything that mattered to me and kept the money." "I know," Rick said, tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. "I know, and I've regretted it every day since. I was drowning in debt and grief, and I convinced myself that you'd be better off on your own. I thought you were strong enough to handle anything." "I was 19 years old," Grace replied. "I just lost my mother and I was struggling to finish school. I needed family, not independence." Rick nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally composed himself, he looked directly at Grace with eyes that held no trace of the anger or resentment she remembered. "I've been sober for 4 months," he said quietly, "going to meetings, working with a sponsor, trying to make amends for the damage I caused. I know I can't undo what I did to you, but I wanted you to know that I recognize how wrong I was. You deserved better from me." Grace felt the familiar anger rising in her chest, the same fury that had sustained her through the worst moments of her homelessness. But underneath the anger was something else: exhaustion. She was tired of carrying the weight of Rick's failures, tired of letting his actions define her story. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come here after almost 2 years?" "Because I heard about what you're doing here," Rick admitted. "Helping people, building something meaningful. Your mother would be so proud of you, Grace. She always said you had the biggest heart of anyone she knew." The mention of her mother's pride hit Grace like a physical blow. For months, she'd convinced herself that she was a failure, that her mother would be disappointed in how far she'd fallen. To hear Rick suggest otherwise was both healing and infuriating. "Don't talk about what Mom would think," Grace said, her voice rising. "You lost the right to speak for her when you chose alcohol over family." Rick accepted the rebuke without argument. "You're right. I just wanted you to know that seeing what you've accomplished here, how you've turned your life around, it gives me hope that maybe I can do the same." Grace stared at this broken man who had caused her so much pain, trying to reconcile his current vulnerability with the cold dismissal he'd shown her after her mother's death. Part of her wanted to walk away without another word, to let him experience the same abandonment he'd forced on her. But another part of her, the part that had been nurtured by Pastor Daniel's grace and Mrs. Elena's compassion, recognized the courage it had taken for him to come here. "I accept your apology," Grace said finally. "But that doesn't mean I'm ready to have you in my life. I've worked too hard to build something good here, to risk having it destroyed by old patterns." Rick nodded, his relief evident even as he absorbed her rejection. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry and that I'm trying to be better. If you ever decide you want to talk, I'm living at the halfway house on Cedar Street. I'll be there for at least another 6 months." After Rick left, Grace sat alone in the sanctuary for a long time, processing the unexpected encounter. Pastor Daniel eventually joined her, settling into the pew beside her without immediately speaking. "How do you feel?" he asked when Grace seemed ready to talk. "Confused," Grace admitted. "Angry, sad, relieved, maybe. I've imagined that conversation so many times, but it never went like that in my head." "Forgiveness is complicated," Daniel said. "It doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It just means choosing not to let someone else's failures define your future." "I'm not ready to forgive him," Grace said. "Not completely, maybe not ever." "That's okay," Daniel replied. "Forgiveness is a process, not a destination. Some days you'll feel more generous than others. The important thing is that you don't let his presence here disrupt the good work you're doing." That night, Grace called Sarah to talk through her feelings about the encounter with Rick. Their friendship had evolved into something deeper than a helper-client relationship. They'd become true companions, supporting each other through the challenges of rebuilding their lives. "Do you think he was sincere?" Sarah asked after Grace had recounted the conversation. "I think so," Grace said. "But I also think sincerity isn't enough. He hurt me badly when I was vulnerable, and now that I'm strong again, he wants forgiveness. It feels convenient for him and costly for me." "Maybe that's okay, though," Sarah suggested. "Maybe the timing doesn't matter as much as the fact that you're in a position to choose what you want to do with his apology. You have power now that you didn't have before." Grace thought about Sarah's words as she prepared for sleep. Power. She did feel powerful in a way she'd never experienced before her mother's death. Not the kind of power that came from money or status, but the power that came from knowing who she was and what she was capable of accomplishing. The next morning brought news that would test that sense of empowerment. Pastor Daniel called Grace into his office with an expression that immediately signaled trouble. "The church board received a letter yesterday," he said, sliding a document across his desk. "The building owner is selling the property. We have 90 days to find a new location or cease operations." Grace read the letter twice, her heart sinking with each word. The church had been renting the building for 15 years, but the owner had decided to sell to a developer who planned to tear down the structure and build condominiums. "What does this mean for the community programs?" Grace asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Unless we can find another space that's affordable and suitable for our needs, we'll have to suspend most of our activities," Daniel said heavily. "The meal service, the resource center, the support groups, everything that requires space and facilities." Grace felt the familiar panic rising in her chest, the same sense of helplessness she'd experienced when her mother died and her stepfather abandoned her. Just when she'd found her purpose and built something meaningful, it was being taken away through circumstances beyond her control. But then she remembered Marcus's words about looking for the good stuff, and Mrs. Elena's insistence that cooking with love made food taste better. The community they'd built wasn't really about the building. It was about the relationships and the commitment to helping each other. "What if we don't just look for another church building?" Grace said, an idea beginning to form. "What if we found a space that was designed for community services from the beginning? Somewhere with a commercial kitchen, meeting rooms, office space for case management?" "That would be ideal," Daniel agreed, "but it would also be expensive. Church buildings are affordable because they're usually owned by the congregation. Commercial space requires rent, insurance, utilities, costs we can't currently afford." Grace spent the rest of the day thinking about the problem and researching potential solutions. She contacted other social service organizations to learn how they'd secured funding and space. She looked into grants and community development programs. She even reached out to some of the people they'd helped over the past months, asking if they knew of any available spaces or funding opportunities. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Martinez mentioned during one of his free clinic sessions that the old community center on Elm Street had been sitting empty for 2 years since the city cut funding for its programs. The building was structurally sound and had been designed specifically for the kind of work Grace envisioned, but it needed extensive cleaning and minor repairs before it could be occupied. "The city council has been looking for a non-profit organization to take over the space," Dr. Martinez explained. "They'd rather see it used for community purposes than sell it to developers, but they need someone who can demonstrate the capacity to maintain and operate it." Grace spent the next week developing a proposal that would make a professional grant writer proud. She outlined the services they currently provided, demonstrated the community need for their programs, and created a detailed budget showing how they could make the community center financially sustainable. She included letters of support from clients, volunteers, and partner organizations, documenting the impact their work had already achieved. The proposal also included a fundraising plan that drew on every connection Grace had made during her months in Pine Valley. Mrs. Elena would organize a community dinner with a silent auction. Marcus would coordinate donated labor for the necessary repairs. Sarah would manage a social media campaign to reach donors beyond their immediate community. Most importantly, Grace included her own story in the proposal. She wrote about arriving at the church on a stormy night with nothing but desperation and finding not just shelter, but a community that believed in second chances and the power of human connection to heal even the deepest wounds. The city council meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday in June. Grace had never spoken at a public meeting before, but Pastor Daniel helped her practice her presentation until she could deliver it with confidence and passion. The night before the meeting, the entire church community gathered for a prayer service that felt more like a celebration of everything they'd accomplished together. Whatever happens tomorrow, Pastor Daniel told the assembled group, we've already succeeded in ways that matter. We've learned that home isn't a building, it's the people who choose to take care of each other. Grace woke up on the morning of the council meeting feeling nervous but determined. She dressed in the navy blue suit Mrs. Elena had helped her buy for job interviews, now repurposed for this more important occasion. As she walked to City Hall, she thought about how different she felt from the broken girl who had stumbled into the church 8 months earlier. The council chambers were packed with supporters, including many of the people whose lives had been touched by the church's programs. Sarah sat in the front row, visibly pregnant now and glowing with health. Marcus had brought several of his apprentice colleagues, men who had found stable employment through the job training program. Mrs. Elena had organized a delegation of senior citizens who relied on the community meals and health clinics. When Grace's name was called, she approached the podium with steady steps and a clear voice. She began by thanking the council for considering their proposal, then launched into the presentation she'd practiced dozens of times. 8 months ago, I was homeless, hopeless, and convinced that my life had no value, she began, making eye contact with each council member as she spoke. I ended up at Pine Valley Community Church because I was caught in a storm and needed shelter. What I found there was something much more valuable than just a dry place to sleep. Grace went on to describe the transformation she'd witnessed in herself and others, the way the church's programs had created a network of support that extended far beyond religious boundaries. She presented the statistics they'd compiled, the number of people who had found employment, secured housing, accessed healthcare, and developed the skills needed to rebuild their lives. We're not asking you to fund a charity, Grace concluded. We're asking you to invest in a proven model for community development that turns people from consumers of services into contributors to society. Every person we help becomes someone who can help others. Every family we stabilize becomes a family that can support their neighbors. This isn't just about providing services, it's about building the kind of community where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. The questions that followed were thoughtful and detailed, covering everything from financial sustainability to program evaluation. Grace answered each one with the confidence of someone who had lived the work she was describing, backing up her personal experience with the research and planning she'd done over the past month. When the public comment period ended, the council members deliberated for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Grace sat with her supporters, holding Sarah's hand and trying to read the expressions on the council members' faces. Finally, the mayor called for a vote. The motion to approve the nonprofit's use of the community center passed unanimously, with several council members commenting on the thoroughness of the proposal and the obvious need for the services Grace had described. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Grace had ever experienced. People who had been strangers 8 months ago embraced her like family, sharing their excitement about the future and their gratitude for her leadership. Pastor Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd, watching with the pride of a mentor who had seen his student exceed every expectation. "I knew you had it in you," he told Grace when the initial excitement had died down. "From that first night when you knocked on our door, I could see the strength underneath the fear. You just needed time and space to remember who you were." The summer months were a whirlwind of activity as Grace coordinated the move to the new community center. Volunteers worked around the clock to clean, paint, and repair the building. Local businesses donated furniture, equipment, and supplies. The same printer who had provided materials for their first resource guides created professional signage for the new facility. Grace found herself working 18-hour days, managing construction schedules, training new volunteers, and maintaining the services that people depended on during the transition. She was exhausted but energized, running on the adrenaline that comes from seeing a vision become reality. The grand opening of the Pine Valley Community Resource Center was held on a Saturday in late August, exactly 1 year after Grace had first arrived at the church. The building was packed with community members, city officials, representatives from partner organizations, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the programs now housed under one roof. Mayor Williams spoke about the importance of community-based solutions to social problems. Dr. Martinez explained how the co-location of services would improve health outcomes for vulnerable populations. To Mrs. Elena blessed the new kitchen where community meals would continue to be prepared with love and served with dignity. But it was Grace's speech that brought tears to many eyes in the audience. Standing at the podium in the main meeting room, wearing the same navy suit she'd worn to the council meeting, but carrying herself with the confidence of someone who had found her calling, she spoke about the power of second chances and the responsibility that comes with being helped. "A year ago, I thought my story was over," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I thought I was just another casualty of circumstances beyond my control. What I learned here is that our stories don't end just because we've experienced loss or failure. Sometimes what feels like an ending is actually a beginning in disguise." Grace looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that had become familiar over the months. The single mothers who had found childcare resources, the veterans who had connected with mental health services, the elderly residents who had discovered they weren't as alone as they'd thought. Each face represented a story of transformation, a life that had been touched by the simple act of showing up and caring about each other. "This center exists because people believe that everyone deserves the chance to rebuild their life with dignity and support," Grace continued. "But more than that, it exists because we've learned that helping others is how we heal ourselves. When we invest in each other's success, we create the kind of community where everyone can thrive." After the formal ceremony, Grace walked through the building with Pastor Daniel, marveling at how the vision they'd discussed in his small office had grown into something larger than either of them had imagined. The conference rooms were already booked for support groups and job training workshops. The computer lab was scheduled to offer digital literacy classes for seniors and job search assistance for unemployed workers. The children's area would provide safe space for kids while their parents attended appointments or classes. "What's next?" Daniel asked as they stood in the main lobby, watching volunteers clean up from the day's celebration. "I start my practicum next month," Grace replied, referring to the final requirement for her social work certification. "I'll be working here 3 days a week and at the county health department 2 days a week. After graduation, I'm hoping to become the center's first official program director. And after that?" Grace smiled, thinking about the master's degree program she'd been researching, the possibility of specializing in community development or trauma-informed care. "After that, we'll see. There's always more work to do, more people to help. I'm just grateful to have found work that feels like a calling instead of just a job." As autumn arrived, Grace settled into the rhythm of her new responsibilities. The community center was busier than they'd anticipated, serving nearly twice as many people as their original projections. The success created new challenges: longer waiting lists, increased demand for services, the need for additional staff and volunteers. But these were the kinds of problems Grace had learned to embrace rather than fear. Her relationship with Rick remained complicated, but had evolved beyond the anger and rejection of their first encounter. He had successfully completed his program at the halfway house and was living in a small apartment downtown, working part-time at a restaurant and attending AA meetings regularly. They met occasionally for coffee, carefully rebuilding trust while acknowledging that their relationship would never be what it had been before her mother's death. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," Rick told her during one of their monthly meetings. "Your mother always said you had the strongest spirit of anyone she knew. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." Grace had learned to accept his apologies without feeling obligated to offer complete forgiveness. Some wounds healed completely, others left scars that served as reminders of lessons learned. Her relationship with Rick fell into the latter category, and she'd made peace with that reality. The first anniversary of Grace's arrival at the church was marked not with celebration but with quiet reflection. She spent the evening in the sanctuary of the old building, which the congregation had arranged to use for one final service before it was demolished to make way for the planned development. Pastor Daniel found her there as darkness fell, sitting in the same pew where she'd first heard him speak about finding hope in unexpected places. The space felt different now, smaller somehow, as if Grace had outgrown the shelter it had once provided. "Any regrets?" Daniel asked, settling beside her in the familiar wooden pew. "About what?" "About staying. About choosing this path instead of continuing to move from place to place. About letting yourself put down roots." Grace considered the question seriously. There were aspects of her old life that she sometimes missed: the freedom of having no obligations, the simplicity of focusing only on immediate survival, the way anonymity had protected her from having to explain her failures to anyone. "No regrets," she said finally. "This is where I was supposed to end up. I can see that now. All those months of wandering weren't really about being lost. They were about finding my way here. And what do you think your mother would say about the woman you've become?" The question would have brought tears a year ago, but now Grace smiled as she considered it. "I think she'd say I finally figured out what she was trying to teach me all along, that the best way to heal your own wounds is to help other people heal theirs." The winter brought new challenges, as the community center expanded its services to include emergency shelter for families facing homelessness. Grace found herself working closely with the County Social Services Department, navigating the complex bureaucracy of government funding while maintaining the personal touch that had made their programs successful. The emergency shelter was Grace's idea, born from her own memory of how it felt to have nowhere safe to sleep. Unlike the institutional facilities run by the county, the center's shelter maintained the feeling of a temporary home rather than an emergency warehouse for displaced people. "Families stay together here," Grace explained to a visiting journalist who was writing about innovative approaches to homelessness. "Children sleep in the same room as their parents. People can cook their own meals if they want to. We treat our guests like neighbors who are going through a difficult time, not like problems to be managed." The article that resulted from the interview brought national attention to the Pine Valley Community Resource Center, leading to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that Grace had never imagined possible. She found herself traveling to other communities, sharing the model they'd developed, and helping other organizations replicate their success. But it was the local impact that mattered most to Grace. She thought about that impact every morning as she walked to work, passing the apartment where Sarah now lived with her healthy baby daughter, the office building where Marcus had secured a full-time position as a facilities manager, the senior housing complex where Mrs. Elena continued to organize community dinners for residents who might otherwise eat alone. Each of these small victories represented someone whose life had been changed by the simple act of showing up and caring. Each success story rippled outward, touching other lives in ways that couldn't always be measured but could always be felt. Spring brought the news that Grace had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Pastor Daniel announced his intention to retire at the end of the summer, transitioning to a part-time role as pastor emeritus while the congregation searched for his replacement. "It's time," he told Grace during one of their weekly coffee meetings. "I've done what I came here to do. The community is strong, the programs are sustainable, and there are capable people in place to carry the work forward. Besides, I'm 63 years old. It's time I learned how to fish for pleasure instead of just for metaphors." Grace felt a familiar panic at the thought of losing the mentor who had guided her transformation from broken wanderer to community leader. But she also recognized that her fear was evidence of how much she'd grown. A year ago, she would have been terrified of being abandoned again. Now she was afraid of losing someone whose opinion and guidance had become integral to her success. "What if I'm not ready to do this without you?" she asked. "You've been doing it without me for months," Daniel replied with a gentle smile. "I've been watching you work, and you don't need my approval or guidance the way you did when you first arrived. You trust your own instincts now. You know what this community needs and how to provide it." Daniel's retirement celebration was held at the community center on a warm evening in late June. The entire sanctuary from the old church had been recreated in the main meeting room, with familiar faces filling folding chairs arranged in rows like pews. The evening included testimonials from dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Daniel's ministry, but it was Grace who was asked to give the final speech. "Pastor Daniel taught me that faith isn't about believing the right things," she began, addressing the crowd that included everyone from city council members to people who still came to the weekly community meals. Faith is about showing up for each other, especially when showing up is difficult or inconvenient or scary. Grace went on to describe how Daniel's example had taught her that healing happens in relationship with others, that redemption is a community project rather than an individual achievement. She spoke about the way he had created space for people to become their best selves without judgment or pressure. He opened his door to a stranger on a stormy night, Grace concluded, and in doing so, he opened the door to a future none of us could have imagined. That door is still open. It will always be open. Because what Pastor Daniel really gave us wasn't just shelter from our storms, he gave us the keys to become the kind of people who open doors for others. The summer passed quickly as Grace prepared to assume new responsibilities within the organization. The board of directors had voted unanimously to create the position of executive director specifically for her, recognizing that her combination of lived experience, formal education, and proven leadership made her uniquely qualified to guide the center's continued growth. The transition was both exciting and daunting. Grace would be responsible for managing a staff of 12 full-time employees, coordinating programs that served hundreds of people each month, and securing the funding necessary to sustain and expand their work. It was a level of responsibility she never could have imagined accepting when she first knocked on the church door. But it was also a natural evolution of work she'd been doing informally for months. The difference now was that she had the authority to make decisions and implement changes without waiting for approval from someone else. She could respond quickly to emerging needs in the community and experiment with innovative approaches to persistent problems. One of Grace's first initiatives as executive director was the creation of a peer mentor program that paired people who were currently receiving services with others who had successfully rebuilt their lives. The idea came from her own experience of being helped by Pastor Daniel and then finding purpose in helping others. People trust advice more when it comes from someone who has walked in their shoes, Grace explained to the staff during a training session. Professional expertise is valuable, but lived experience is irreplaceable. When someone who has been homeless tells you that recovery is possible, you believe them in a way that's different from hearing the same message from someone who has only studied homelessness academically. The peer mentor program was an immediate success, with participants reporting higher levels of engagement and faster progress toward their goals. Other organizations began reaching out to learn about the model, and Grace found herself once again in the position of sharing their innovations with communities across the region. As autumn arrived, Grace reflected on the circular nature of her journey. 2 years earlier, she had been a person in crisis, seeking help from strangers and wondering if her life would ever have meaning again. Now she was providing the same kind of support to others that had once saved her, completing a circle of care that stretched back to that stormy night when Pastor Daniel had simply asked if she was hungry. The reflection was prompted by a familiar scene playing out in the community center's lobby. A young man, probably not much older than Grace had been when she arrived in Pine Valley, stood hesitantly near the information desk, looking around with the wary expression of someone who expected to be turned away. Grace approached him with the same gentle directness that Pastor Daniel had once shown her. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. "I heard you have meals here," the young man said quietly. "Free meals. I haven't eaten in 2 days." "We do," Grace confirmed. "Dinner is served at 6, but if you can't wait that long, I can get you something from the kitchen right now. Are you new to town?" The young man nodded, his relief evident as he realized he wouldn't be questioned or judged. "I've been traveling for a while, looking for work, but it's hard when you don't have an address or clean clothes for interviews." Grace listened to his story with the attention of someone who remembered what it felt like to be desperate and ashamed of that desperation. She made mental notes about the services he would need: temporary housing, job search assistance, perhaps counseling to address whatever trauma had set him on the road in the first place. But more than providing services, Grace offered something harder to quantify but easier to recognize: the sense that he was seen as a whole person rather than just a collection of problems to be solved. She remembered how that feeling had been the first step in her own healing, the foundation on which everything else had been built. After getting the young man connected with immediate resources and scheduled for a comprehensive intake appointment the next day, Grace found herself thinking about the conversation Pastor Daniel had initiated on her first morning at the church. He had asked what she wanted to do with her life, a question that had seemed impossible to answer at the time. Now she knew. She wanted to be the person who kept the door open for others caught in storms. She wanted to create spaces where people could remember who they were underneath their circumstances. She wanted to build communities where everyone had the opportunity to discover their own capacity for resilience and contribution. That evening, Grace walked through the quiet community center after the last client had left and the staff had gone home. She moved through rooms that hummed with the energy of lives being rebuilt, stopping to straighten chairs and turn off lights, taking inventory of the day's small victories and tomorrow's challenges. In the main meeting room, she paused before the framed photograph that hung near the entrance, a picture taken on the center's opening day, showing Grace cutting the ribbon while surrounded by the people who had made the moment possible. Pastor Daniel stood to her right, his pride evident in his smile. Mrs. Elena beamed from the front row, still wearing the apron she'd used to serve lunch to the volunteers. Marcus stood with his fellow apprentices, living proof that second chances could lead to stable employment and restored dignity. But it was the faces in the background that moved Grace most, the clients who had become friends, the volunteers who had become family, the community members who had chosen to invest in a vision of mutual support rather than individual success. These were the people who had taught her that healing happens in relationship with others, that redemption is always a community project. Grace's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah, who was now working as a family advocate at the county health department while finishing her own degree in social work. The message included a photo of Sarah's daughter taking her first steps, along with the words, "She's going to grow up in a world where people like you exist. Thank you for that." Standing alone in the building that had grown from her own experience of being helped when she needed it most, Grace felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing your life has meaning beyond your own survival. She thought about the young man who had arrived that afternoon, wondering what his story would look like a year from now if he chose to accept the help being offered. She thought about Pastor Daniel, now happily retired and volunteering as a mentor for other former military personnel struggling with the transition to civilian life. She thought about Mrs. Elena, whose kitchen had become the heart of a nutrition program that served 300 families each month. She thought about Marcus, who was planning to open his own contracting business, specializing in accessible housing modifications for disabled residents. Each of these stories was connected to her own, part of a web of relationships that had grown from the simple act of one person asking another if they were hungry. Grace had learned that this was how grace actually worked, not as a divine intervention that solved problems instantly, but as a human commitment to show up for each other, especially when showing up was difficult. The storm that had driven Grace to the church 2 years earlier had been the kind of external crisis that forces life-changing decisions. But the real storm had been internal, the grief, fear, and self-doubt that had convinced her she was worthless and alone. That storm had taken longer to pass, requiring not just shelter but the patient work of rebuilding trust in herself and others. Now, as she locked the community center and walked to her car under a sky bright with stars, Grace understood that storms would always be part of life. The difference was that she no longer faced them alone, and she had learned to help others find shelter when their own storms arrived. Her phone rang as she drove through the quiet streets of Pine Valley, heading home to the small apartment she'd rented 6 months earlier, the first place that had ever felt truly hers. The call was from the answering service at the community center, relaying a message from someone who needed emergency assistance. Grace didn't hesitate before turning her car around and heading back to work. There was always one more person who needed help, one more crisis that required attention, one more opportunity to keep the door open for someone caught in a storm. As she pulled into the parking lot of the community center, Grace saw a figure huddled near the entrance, a woman with 2 small children, all of them soaked from the rain that had begun to fall. For a moment, Grace was transported back to her own first night, remembering what it felt like to need help from strangers. She approached the family with keys in hand and kindness in her voice, ready to offer what had once been offered to her, a warm place to sleep, a hot meal, and the radical possibility that their story wasn't over yet. "Are you here for shelter?" Grace asked gently, unlocking the door and gesturing for them to come inside. "We have space tonight, and there's soup in the kitchen." The woman looked up with tears of relief streaming down her face. "We've been trying to find somewhere safe for 3 days. My children are so tired." "You're safe now," Grace said, the same words Pastor Daniel had spoken to her 2 years earlier. "Come in. Let's get you all warm and fed. and tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." As Grace led the family into the building, she felt the familiar sense of purpose that came from being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The storm outside would pass, as all storms eventually did, but the door would remain open, and Grace would be there to answer when the next person knocked, carrying their own storms and hoping for shelter. Sometimes the most important work was simply showing up, believing that everyone deserved the chance to rebuild their life with dignity and support. Sometimes the most profound ministry was offering soup and a safe place to sleep to strangers caught in the rain. Grace understood now that she had been saved not by avoiding storms, but by learning to find shelter in community and purpose in helping others do the same. Her story had become proof that no one was beyond help, that every ending could become a beginning, and that grace was most powerful when it moved from person to person like light, passing from candle to candle in the darkness. The church bells chimed midnight as Grace settled the family into their temporary quarters, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the sky, bringing rain to wash the world clean and storms to drive other lost souls toward doors where they might find exactly what they needed to begin again.